April 1945. Berlin is burning, and the Red Army is grinding street by street toward a concrete bunker buried beneath the ruined heart of the Reich. In every other war in history, this is the moment the dictator runs. He slips out a side door, makes for the border, bargains for one more day of life. Mussolini ran for the northern frontier. Saddam ran to a hole in the ground. Gaddafi ran into a drainage pipe. Adolf Hitler did the opposite. And he always did the opposite. Where other tyrants purged their rivals, he kept the same faces beside him for more than 20 years. Where others shielded their armies, he fed his into the snow. Where others fled, he stayed and turned a pistol on himself. People call that madness or nerve or cold genius. It was none of those things. Every rule the others followed was a break, the survival instinct that makes a tyrant negotiate, retreat, and bend. Hitler had no breaks because he was the only one who never cared whether he or Germany lived to see the morning. He wasn't running a country, he was running a countdown. Every strongman of the 20th century read from the same script, even if none of them ever bothered to write it down. The rules were simple, and they were always about one thing: staying alive and staying on top. Purge your rivals before they purge you. Keep the army close, because the men with the guns are the only ones who can drag you out of your palace. And when the walls finally come down, when the tanks are in the capital and the cause is lost, you run. You save yourself, because underneath everything, the regime was always a machine for protecting the man at the top. Stalin played it to perfection. Mussolini played it almost to the very end. Saddam Hussein played it. Muammar Gaddafi played it. Different countries, different decades, different ideologies, but the same survival instinct humming beneath all of it. Adolf Hitler did the opposite of every single rule, and here's the part that matters, the part this whole story turns on. That wasn't because he was sharper than the rest of them. It wasn't strategic brilliance. Those rules, purge, protect, flee, are the breaks. They're what keeps a tyranny self-interested, which is exactly what keeps it negotiable. A dictator who wants to survive can be bargained with, cornered, made to retreat. Hitler tore the brakes out, and a regime with no brakes doesn't become more impressive. It becomes more catastrophic. Look at a photograph from 1922, then look at one from 1945, and you'll notice something that should be impossible. Hermann Göring stood beside Hitler in 1922. Heinrich Himmler joined the circle in 1923. Joseph Goebbels came aboard in 1926. And those same men, Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, were still standing beside him in the rubble of 1945, more than 2 decades later. The inner circle barely changed. Now hold that up against Stalin. In the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, Stalin turned the machinery of his own state against the people who ran it. The official records count roughly 681,000 executions in those 2 years alone, and broader estimates push the figure anywhere from 700,000 to well over 1 million. He didn't just thin the ranks, he decapitated his own army on the eve of a world war. 3 of his 5 marshals gone. 13 of 15 army commanders gone. 8 of 9 admirals gone. Stalin looked at the men closest to him and saw threats to be eliminated. It's tempting to read Hitler's loyal circle as a virtue. See, he kept his friends. Don't. That stability isn't warmth. It's the first clue that his regime was never built around his own paranoid survival the way every other one was. Stalin protected Stalin. Hitler protected the mission. And if you want to see how far that mission went, stay with me, because in his final weeks he signed an order no survival-minded tyrant would ever put his name to. And I'd subscribe before we get to it, because that single decree is where this story stops being merely strange and turns into something far worse. Before we go one step further into how unlike other dictators he was, we have to be brutally clear about what that difference actually produced. Because the word different can sound almost flattering if you're not careful, and there is nothing flattering here. The regime Hitler built had a purpose, and the bee's purpose was murder. The systematic industrial killing of 6 million Jewish men, women and children across occupied Europe. Not a byproduct of the war, not collateral damage from a fight for territory. It was the central organising project of the state itself, with the camps, the transport networks, the killing centres, and the whole bureaucracy of death constructed, staffed and funded to carry it out at scale. Every other dictator in this story killed to hold power. The terror served the throne. With Hitler, the relationship flipped. Power served the killing. The state existed to feed the machine, not the other way around. Keep that firmly in mind, because everything that follows, the loyalty, the legal road to power, the refusal to retreat, the refusal to run, only means anything when you remember what it was all in service of. When this story says he was unlike other tyrants, this is the difference it's pointing at. And the difference didn't make him grander, it made him deadlier than any of them. Here's something that should stop you cold. One of the most notorious fascists who ever lived once thought Hitler's core belief was lunacy. Before the Axis alliance bound them together, Benito Mussolini, Italy's own dictator, no one's idea of a moderate, openly rejected Nazi racial doctrine. He dismissed the whole master race idea as arrant nonsense, stupid and idiotic, and he called anti-Semitism a German vice, a sickness that belonged to the North and not to Italy. Those exact words come down to us through a book of conversations the writer Emil Ludwig published in 1932. And it's only fair to say that several historians question how precisely Ludwig transcribed what was actually said. But the underlying point doesn't rest on the wording. Mussolini, on the record, before the alliance, treated Nazi racial obsession as something embarrassing and strange, not as ordinary politics pushed a little further. Sit with what that means. The thing a fellow fascist waved off as a German embarrassment became the entire organising principle of Hitler's state. Mussolini's own racial laws, when they finally came, were largely a concession to his ally. Bolted on, opportunistic, late. For Hitler, it was the foundation everything else was built to serve. This wasn't standard tyranny taken to an extreme. It was something his own contemporaries recognised as a departure from the script and recoiled from before politics taught them to stop. There was no coup, no civil war, no march on the capital with guns drawn. The most destructive dictator of the century came to power legally, through the front door of a democracy that handed him the key. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. It happened through a backroom deal struck by conservative elites who were absolutely certain they had the situation under control. They saw a loud, useful rabble-rouser they could install in the Chancellery, surround with their own men and steer. They thought they were hiring him. They thought they owned him. Within weeks, that confidence detonated. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed what became known as the Enabling Act, handing the power to make laws straight to Hitler's cabinet. It passed by a wide margin. In a single vote, the Parliament of a constitutional republic signed away its own authority and gave it to the one man it should never have trusted with it. The brilliance, if you can stomach calling it that, wasn't Hitler's alone. It was the catastrophic miscalculation of everyone who underestimated him. They believed a man could be loaned absolute power and then reeled back in. He took the power they offered, kept it, and turned it on them. By the time they understood what they'd done, there was no one left who could undo it. By the winter of 1942, 250,000 German soldiers were trapped in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, and there was still a way out. His generals knew it. The encircled 6th Army could have attempted a breakout to the west while a corridor still existed. A desperate gamble, but a chance. Hitler forbade it. No breakout, no retreat. Hold the city that bore his enemy's name to the last man. So they held, in temperatures that froze the wounded where they fell, eating their horses, and then eating nothing at all. February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of the 6th Army surrendered, around 91,000 men shuffling into Soviet captivity, starving, frostbitten, broken. Of those 91,000, only somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 ever saw home again. The rest died in the snow, on the marches, in the camps. It's easy to file this under simple incompetence, a stubborn amateur overruling the professionals. But that lets him off too easily. Stalingrad wasn't a bad call inside an otherwise rational war effort. It was the first clear sign that the war and the ideology had stopped pointing the same direction. That when the mission and military reality collided, Hitler chose the mission every time and fed his own army into the gap. And that pattern was about to reach somewhere far darker. By 1944, Germany had already lost the war, and that is exactly when the murder reached its most furious pace. Read that again, because it breaks every rule of how a regime built to survive is supposed to behave. The Allies were closing from the west, the Soviets grinding in from the east, the Reich collapsing on two fronts. A state organised around its own survival would have thrown every last man, every train, and every ounce of attention at holding the line. Hitler's regime poured it into Auschwitz instead. Between roughly the middle of May and the start of July 1944, under 2 months, about 437,000 Jews were deported from Hungary to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The overwhelming majority were murdered within hours of arrival. It was the single most intense phase of the entire Holocaust, and it unfolded while the war was visibly lost. Now, one careful note, because the truth here is damning enough without exaggeration. It's sometimes claimed that the trains to the camps were stealing rail capacity straight from the front. The transport record is murkier than that. Deportation trains were often a low priority and frequently waited on military and goods traffic. So the honest point isn't about literal diverted trains. It's about where the regime put its manpower, its rolling stock, its command attention, and its will. Historians like Ian Kershaw, Timothy Snyder, and Saul Friedlander have made the reading hard to escape. By 1944, winning the war had become secondary to finishing the killing. The machine no longer served the state. The state was being spent to feed the machine. Then he tried to destroy Germany itself. Not the enemy, Germany. On March 19th, 1945, with the Reich in its final convulsions, Hitler issued what history remembers as the Nero Decree. The official title was dry and bureaucratic, something about demolitions in Reich territory. What it actually ordered was the annihilation of his own nation's lifeblood: the bridges, the factories, the power stations, the rail lines and the stores of food the German people would need to stay alive once the fighting stopped. According to Albert Speer, who later testified about it at Nuremberg, Hitler laid out the reasoning with chilling calm. If Germany was going to lose the war, then Germany had shown itself to be the weaker nation, and the weaker, in his mind, deserved to perish. There was no need to preserve anything for the people's survival. Let them go down with him. Think about who that order was aimed at. Every other dictator built his regime to protect a base, a party, a class, a people, a tribe whose loyalty kept him in power. Hitler turned the death drive inward, onto the very Germans he claimed to embody. The decree was largely never carried out, partly because Speer himself quietly worked to sabotage it, and that tells you something too. His authority was already crumbling, but the intent is the point. A man trying to survive does not order the destruction of the country he needs to survive in. Picture how the other tyrants ended. Mussolini was caught on a road heading north, dragged from a convoy and shot, his body strung up in a Milan square. Saddam Hussein was hauled out of a dirt hole in the ground, filthy and disoriented. Gaddafi was pulled from a drainage pipe by a mob. Every one of them, when the end came, did the same instinctive thing. They tried to live. They ran. They hid. They bargained for one more day. Hitler stayed in Berlin. As the Red Army fought street by street toward the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he made no run for the Alps, no dash for a submarine, to South America. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself from a certain angle that can almost look like nihilistic courage, the captain going down with the ship. It isn't. It's the logical last move of a man who was never trying to survive in the first place. You can't really say someone refused to flee in defeat when survival was never the goal to begin with. And here's the proof that the whole thing died with him. Stalin's system outlasted Stalin by nearly 4 decades. Hitler's caretaker government surrendered just over a week after his suicide. Across Germany, a wave of suicides rolled through the leadership and the civilian population. People who genuinely could not imagine existing in a world without him or the cause. A regime built around one apocalyptic mission, and one man had nothing to stand on the moment both were gone. It wasn't self-sustaining. It was the opposite. It was designed, whether anyone admitted it or not, to end. So let's kill the dangerous misreading before it can take root. Breaking the dictator's rules did not make Hitler impressive. It did not make him a misunderstood strategic genius. Every time this story shows him doing the opposite of Stalin, or Mussolini, or Saddam, it is not paying him a compliment. It is naming the exact thing that made him worse. Here's the logic, plain as it gets. A survival-driven tyrant has limits baked in. He negotiates because he wants to be around tomorrow. He retreats because a living dictator beats a dead one. He compromises because the regime is ultimately about him. Those instincts are ugly, but they're also brakes. They're the reason most tyrannies can eventually be cornered, contained, and ended without burning the whole world down. A mission-driven one has none of that. No floor, no ceiling, no off-ramp. He won't negotiate the genocide, because the genocide is the point. He won't retreat from it, because there's nothing behind it to retreat to. He'll spend his army, his people, and finally himself to keep it moving. Remove the brakes and you don't get a faster, sharper machine. You get one with no way to stop. And at the end of that machine sat 6 million murdered human beings and a continent in ruins. Which leaves one question worth arguing about. Was Hitler the engine of all this? The single will that drove it? Or was he something stranger? A figurehead whose machinery, his ministers, his ideologues, his willing executioners, simply worked toward building the horror in his name and handing it to him finished? Where you land on that says a great deal about how you think catastrophe actually happens. If this is the kind of deep dive you come to History Hangover for, the figures who shaped the darkest corners of the 20th century, and the questions their lives still leave open, then, like this video, subscribe and hit the bell so the next one finds you. Thanks for watching History Hangover.